All right, welcome back, everyone. We're diving back into current affairs, specifically for all of you UPSC aspirants out there.
That's right, keeping you up to date and ready to tackle those exams.
Exactly. So this is part 2 of our deep dive into the news from April 19th, 2025.
And just a heads up, some of what we discussed today might touch on topics we've covered in previous deep dives.
Yeah, think of it as a good refresher, solidifying those key concepts. So what's on the docket today?
We've got quite the lineup. We'll be looking at the merging of regional rural banks, or RRBs, a pretty big Supreme Court ruling on the powers that governors have. Then we'll touch on the Panchayat Advancement Index.
And we can't forget about the GenomeIndia project and those initial findings. Plus, we'll delve into efforts to boost electronics manufacturing in India.
Oh, and one more thing. We'll be checking out the first ever green status assessment for the Lion.
As always, we're aiming to cut through the noise and give you those crucial insights and connections, the ones that will really help you in your UPSC prep.
That's right. We want to go beyond just knowing the headlines and really get into the why behind these developments. So, ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Let's do it. Let's kick things off with a pretty big development in the banking world, one that's especially relevant to rural India.
You're talking about the consolidation of regional rural banks, right?
Exactly. The Department of Financial Services just recently put out a notification
Outlining how they're going to be merging 26 RRBs.
and they're doing this based on a one state, one RRB principle.
This whole idea of consolidating RRBs, this isn't exactly new. What's interesting is that this is actually the fourth phase of this kind of consolidation.
Really?
Yeah, the first push actually came from the Vias Committee. You remember their recommendations?
Right.
And through the past 3 phases, we've seen a huge drop in the number of RRBs all over the country. We started with 196 and got down to just 43 by the end of the 2020-21 financial year.
That's a significant reduction. And this whole process of merging RRBs, there's a specific law behind it, isn't there?
You got it. The legal framework for setting up and running these RRBs is the Regional Rural Banks Act of 1976. Now, let's break down this one state, one RRB principle. Sounds pretty straightforward, right?
One state, one bank. Seems pretty simple.
But what does it mean practically, for those studying this for the UPSC?
Well, I guess it means that the government wants to have just one RRB operating within each state.
That's the idea.
And this single RRB would then be sponsored by a major public sector bank.
Precisely. And we're already seeing a great example of this in Bihar.
So,
They're merging the existing Dakshin Bihar Gramin Bank and Uttar Bihar Gramin Bank to form a brand new one,
what will it be called?
the Bihar Gramin Bank.
Yeah.
Headquartered in Patna, and guess who the sponsoring bank is?
Punjab National Bank.
Spot on. But we should probably rewind a bit and remember why these RRBs were set up in the first place.
Right. They were created back in 1975, with the act coming in 1976.
And they had a very clear purpose.
To provide credit and banking services to those who were often overlooked by traditional banks.
Exactly. We're talking about small farmers, agricultural laborers, rural entrepreneurs, and artisans.
And the goal was to really boost development in rural areas.
Focusing on agriculture, trade, small-scale industries.
Starting an RRB isn't just automatic.
Right. It's actually the central government that initiates the process, and they do it based on a request from a sponsoring public sector bank.
Now, when it comes to UPSC prep, the ownership structure of these RRBs, that's something to pay attention to.
Oh, absolutely. You need to know how it breaks down.
Do tell.
It's a pretty unique setup, actually. It's a 3-way split.
3-way?
Yeah. The central government holds the biggest chunk, 50% ownership.
Okay, and the rest?
The state government has a 15% share, and the sponsoring bank takes the remaining 35%.
So it's a real joint effort. And who keeps an eye on these RRBs? Who regulates them?
Well, when it comes to regulation, it's the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI. They do it under the Banking Regulation Act of 1949.
Makes sense.
But NABARD, the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development, they play a big role in supervision as well.
Interesting. So there are multiple layers of oversight.
Exactly. Now, here's a quirky little detail.
Yeah.
When it comes to taxes, RRBs are treated like cooperative societies.
Really? Under what act?
The Income Tax Act of 1961. And one more crucial thing they need to keep in mind, they have to maintain a SHRA of 9%.
SHRAR. Remind me what that is again.
Capital to risk-weighted assets ratio.
Yeah.
Basically, it's a measure of how financially stable a bank is, and the RBI sets that 9% benchmark.
Right. So we've covered what's happening with these mergers and the background of RBs, but the big question is why this renewed push to consolidate? What are the benefits?
Well, there are quite a few reasons behind these mergers. One of the main drivers is definitely trying to improve efficiency.
In what sense?
These larger merged RRBs, they're expected to have a stronger capital base.
Which makes them more financially secure.
Exactly. Plus, they can benefit from economies of scale, reducing those overhead costs and making better use of their staff.
Makes sense.
Another aspect is reducing competition among RRBs operating in the same state. Sometimes all that competition can actually hinder progress.
I see. So it's about working together rather than against each other.
Right. And looking ahead, these larger RRBs will be in a much better position to embrace new technologies like AI and blockchain. They'll need to be more competitive in the financial market as a whole.
That makes sense.
But ultimately, it's all about better serving the customer. Improved technology, better infrastructure, a more skilled workforce.
And offering a broader range of banking services.
Exactly. And reaching a wider customer base, too.
Yeah.
Now, here's a question for you to think about as you study. What might be some of the challenges when you try to blend different regional banking cultures?
That's a good point.
How can these larger entities ensure that the specific needs of diverse rural communities are still being met?
That's something to definitely consider. So, for those prepping for the UPSC, why is this whole RRB development so important to focus on?
Well, if you connect this to the bigger themes in your syllabus, it really ties into financial inclusion and rural development.
Both big topics in the UPSC exam.
Absolutely. It's also a real-world example of government policy in the banking sector. Plus, it gives you some valuable insights into the way the Indian financial system is structured.
Like those unique characteristics and even how cooperative societies are treated for taxes.
Precisely. So understanding the why behind these mergers and the potential impact, it's all pretty important.
All right, let's switch gears now and move over to the world of law and the Constitution. The Supreme Court recently made a pretty big decision about the powers governors have.
Oh, you mean concerning those bills passed by state legislatures?
Exactly, specifically within Article 200 of the Constitution.
The case that sparked it all was the state of Tamil Nadu versus the governor of Tamil Nadu.
A landmark judgment, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. The Supreme Court actually had to use its special powers under Article 142 just to ensure complete justice was served.
What's remarkable is how much clarity this judgment provides on an issue that's often been, well, a bit murky.
It's been a source of debate for sure.
So what are the main takeaways from this ruling? What absolutely needs to be on the radar of our listeners who are prepping for the UPSC?
First and foremost, the Supreme Court was very clear. Governors don't have an absolute veto power.
No, absolute veto.
Nope. And they also don't have what's often called a pocket veto for bills.
Interesting. So they can't just sit on a bill and do nothing.
Yeah, that's right. The court emphasized that the phrase "as soon as possible" in Article 200 means just that, a sense of urgency. Governors can't just delay indefinitely.
That makes sense. What else?
Second big takeaway. Once a bill is sent back by the state legislature and it's unchanged from its original form, the governor has to give their assent.
They can't say no?
Not in that case. And they also can't just send it off to the president unless the content of the bill has been altered.
That's a pretty clear limitation on the governor's discretionary powers. What else did the court address?
Well, they reinforced a fundamental principle, which is that the governor is generally bound to act on the advice given by the state government's Council of Ministers.
Right. That's a key principle of responsible government.
Exactly. The only exception to this, and it's explicitly stated in Article 200, is for bills that might affect the powers of the High Court or the Supreme Court.
So in those cases, the governor has a bit more leeway.
That's right. Now, to prevent things from getting bogged down and to make sure things move along efficiently, the court has laid out clear timelines.
Timelines for what exactly?
Timelines for when governors are expected to take action on those bills that come to them under Article 200. And if they don't stick to those timelines, what happens?
What happened?
That inaction becomes subject to judicial review.
So the courts can step in and say, hey, you need to act on this.
Exactly. And that's a pretty significant development, in terms of defining the limits of what a governor can and can't do.
Definitely a check on their power. Can you give us a quick rundown of the different options a governor has under Article 200?
Sure. And let's include those specific timelines the court has now set.
Right, because that's important.
So when a bill that's been passed by the state legislature gets to the governor's desk, they've got a few choices.
What are their options?
They can give their assent, straight up approval, or they can withhold their assent, basically say no.
Okay, what else?
They can reserve the bill, send it up the chain to the president, or if it's not a money bill, they can send it back to the legislature with a message.
What kind of message?
Asking them to reconsider it, maybe
Right.
suggesting some changes, amendments to the
Right,
bill.
okay, makes sense.
Now, if the legislature repasses the bill, whether they've made changes or not, the governor has to give their assent. It's mandatory at that point.
So they don't have a choice then.
Nope, not unless the content of that repassed bill is totally different.
Right. So what about reserving a bill for the president? When can a governor do that?
They're allowed to do that if they think the bill might harm the powers of the state's high court.
Interesting. So onto those timelines.
Okay, so for withholding assent or reserving a bill for the president, the governor has to act within 1 month.
1 month, got it.
Now, if they reserve a bill for the president but go against the advice of the State Council of Ministers, that has to happen within 3 months.
Okay, bit longer there.
Right. And for giving assent to a bill that's been represented, that also has a 1-month timeline.
1 month again. And what about returning the bill?
If the governor wants to withhold assent, saying no, but they're going against the advice of the Council of Ministers, and they decide to send the bill back to the legislature, they have to do it within 3 months.
3 months. So those timelines, they really change the game, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. How might these new timelines affect lawmaking at the state level?
And the whole relationship between the governor and the elected government.
Exactly. Lots to think about there. And this whole ruling, it's a big deal for UPSC aspirants.
Huge implications. Why should they pay close attention to this?
Well, for starters, it directly relates to the Indian polity section of the syllabus. You need to understand those key constitutional provisions, like Articles 200 and 142.
Right, essential knowledge.
This ruling gives us real insight into the separation of powers at the state level, clarifies the governor's role and responsibilities.
And has a huge impact on center-state relations.
Ooh, for sure. Plus, it really gets into the scope of judicial review in these constitutional matters. So, yeah, lots to unpack there.
Lots to unpack. Okay, let's move away from the legal stuff now and head over to grassroots development. The Ministry of Panchayat Raj has introduced something called the Panchayat Advancement Index.
The PA.
Right, the PAI.
And what's really interesting is how extensive this assessment is. They've analyzed data from about 2.16 lakh gram panchayats.
Across how many states?
29 states. And considering there are about 2.5 lakh gram panchayats across the country, this is a pretty massive undertaking.
A major effort to evaluate these local institutions. And just as a reminder, they're established under Article 243B of the Constitution, right?
That's right, specifically for those rural areas.
Okay, so what is this Panchayat Advancement Index trying to do? What's the goal?
Well, the PAI is what we call a multi-domain, multi-sectoral index. It's basically trying to give a comprehensive evaluation of the development, performance, and progress made by these gram panchayats.
And it uses a lot of different factors, I'd imagine.
Well, definitely. And here's the crucial part. It's designed to measure how well these institutions are contributing to achieving those localized sustainable development goals.
The SDGs. So it's about aligning local efforts with those global goals.
Precisely.
So what specific areas or themes does the PII look at when it evaluates a panchayat?
They focus on 9 key themes, all crucial for local development.
9 themes?
Yeah, it's pretty thorough. They look at poverty reduction and livelihood enhancement, health, making sure the panchayat is child-friendly, water sufficiency, environmental sustainability, having enough infrastructure.
So it's about the basics, the essentials for a community to thrive.
Exactly. They also look at social justice and security, good governance, and promoting a women-friendly environment.
This is really broad perspective.
It is. It covers a wide range of aspects of rural life and governance.
What were some of the findings from this first assessment using the PAI? How did the panchayats do?
Well, they categorized the panchayats based on their performance.
Like a ranking system.
Sort of. And what's interesting is that in this first assessment, not a single panchayat in India managed to reach the highest rank achiever.
Wow, not one.
Most of them, about 61.2%, fell into the aspirant category.
Meaning they still have a ways to go.
That's right. And about 36% were labeled performers, so they're making decent progress.
Who came out on top?
Gujarat had the most panchayats in the frontrunner category, making them the overall best performer.
Interesting. So the fact that no panchayat reached the top level, that kind of highlights the challenges, right?
Oh, absolutely. It shows there's a lot of room for improvement at the grassroots.
What do you think are some of the main hurdles keeping these gram panchayats from becoming achievers across all those themes?
That's a great question and something for all of us to consider.
Now, for our UPSC folks out there, why should they care about this Panchayat Advancement Index?
It's directly tied to the Panchayati Raj Institutions section of the syllabus. That's the PRI section.
Right, a key part of the exam.
Plus, it fits into those bigger themes of rural development and decentralized governance.
Making those connections is so important.
It is. And the PAI also shows that connection between good local governance and achieving those sustainable development goals.
So, understanding the details of this index, the findings, it really helps you grasp the government's priorities.
Their initiatives, especially when it comes to strengthening local governance and supporting development at the grassroots.
Great points. All right, let's jump into the world of science and technology now.
Sounds good to me.
We've got those preliminary findings from the GenomeIndia project to discuss.
This is big news.
It is, and this research was just published in Nuclear Genetics, one of the most respected journals in the field.
It's a significant step forward in understanding India's genetic diversity.
Tell us more about the findings.
They've managed to identify a whopping 180 million genetic variants.
180 million. How did they find so many?
They analyzed the genomes of almost 10,000 people from across the country. To be exact, 9,772 individuals.
That's a massive study.
It is. Now, just as a quick refresher for those who might not be genetics experts,
I'm sure some of our listeners could use a reminder.
a gene variant is basically a permanent change in the DNA sequence of a gene.
Okay, so it's like a slight alteration in the building blocks of our genes.
Exactly. And the genome.
That's a whole set of genetic material, right?
You got it. Everything in an individual or a species.
So this study looked at a lot of genetic information.
Huge amount.
Can you talk a bit more about how broad and inclusive the study was?
Well, they didn't just focus on one group of people. They included both tribal and non-tribal groups.
Representing various backgrounds.
Yeah, from various linguistic families found in India. Tibeto-Burman, Indo-European, Dravidian, Austroasiatic.
Wow, that covers a lot of ground.
They also included individuals from those mixed populations, which really reflects India's complex history, how different groups have interacted and mixed over time.
Fascinating. What else did they analyze?
They didn't just look at those regular chromosomes, the autosomes.
Right.
They looked at the sex chromosomes, too, the X and Y chromosomes.
So it's a very complete picture. Why is this kind of study so important for India in particular?
Well, there are a few reasons. First off, it really gives us a peek into the genetic makeup of the Indian population. While about 99.9% of our DNA is the same, it's that 0.1% difference that's key.
The part that makes each of us unique.
Right. And that difference holds clues about our susceptibility to certain diseases.
Including those rare inherited disorders we sometimes hear about.
Exactly. This knowledge also helps us understand those ancient migrations, the natural selection processes, and how different communities in India have adapted over thousands of years.
So we're learning about our past and present health through this study.
In a way, yes. The second reason this is so significant is that all this data can be used to create a reference panel of those genetic variants common in the Indian population.
Kind of like a genetic map specific to India.
You could think of it that way. And researchers can use this map for future studies, especially those smaller ones, to pinpoint those disease-causing genes more accurately.
That makes sense. And I bet there are huge implications for healthcare.
Absolutely. This research could lead to more affordable and effective diagnostic tools. It can really boost the field of precision medicine, helping us diagnose diseases more accurately and predict how people might respond to different treatments.
Personalized medicine.
Exactly. And in the long run, it can help develop public health interventions that are tailored to our unique genetic makeup.
That's a pretty exciting prospect. Now, as you're studying this, think about those ethical considerations. What does it mean to have such detailed genetic information about a large population?
That's a really crucial point to ponder.
Okay, so back to the GenomeIndia project itself. Tell us a little about how it got started and what its main goals are.
Well, it was launched back in 2020 by the Department of Biotechnology.
And they brought together a lot of different institutions, didn't they?
Yeah, a whole consortium of 20 research institutions from all over the country.
A true collaborative effort.
The goal was ambitious. They wanted to map the genetic diversity of the Indian population.
A very ambitious goal.
The main objective was to create a detailed catalog of those genetic variations found in different groups within India. It's meant to be a valuable resource for future research.
And they've already hit a major milestone, right?
Yep, they've completed whole genome sequencing for 10,000 samples.
Impressive. Where is all this data stored?
It's being kept at the Indian Biological Data Center, IBDC for short.
Okay.
It's located in Faridabad, Haryana.
So, for our UPSC audience, where does this GenomeIndia project fit into their syllabus?
It's primarily under the science and technology section, especially the biotechnology and genomics parts.
Right, those are key areas.
But it also links to health and disease topics. And for those interested in anthropology, this project offers a lot of insight into human diversity and history.
So it really spans multiple disciplines.
It does, and it's a prime example of a government-led research initiative that's meant to benefit the entire population's health and well-being.
Let's shift gears now and talk about something a little more tangible, the manufacturing sector. The Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, MADI, has just announced the Electronics Components Manufacturing Scheme.
This scheme is really about building a strong foundation for India's electronics industry.
And I imagine it's all about making those essential electronic components right here in India.
You got it. The goal is to create a self-sustaining ecosystem for domestic manufacturing.
And why is it so important for India to ramp up its manufacturing, especially for electronic components?
There are several reasons. First, think about national security. We rely so much on components made overseas, especially for sensitive areas like defense and infrastructure.
That does leave us vulnerable.
It does. We face potential data breaches, disruptions in supply chains. Right now, a huge chunk of our electronics, telecom, and electrical imports, about 56%, comes from China and Hong Kong.
That's a significant percentage.
It is. Now, India has seen some impressive growth in producing finished electronic goods.
That's true, the Make in India initiative and all that.
Exactly. But the problem is that we're still importing a lot of the core components. Our local capacity hasn't caught up.
So we're making the end products, but not necessarily the core building blocks.
Right, and this is where opportunity knocks. You see, a lot of companies are looking to diversify their supply chains, move away from relying solely on China. It's the whole China plus one trend.
Just so India can step in and fill that gap.
Precisely. But there are challenges. Setting up manufacturing here, it requires a lot of capital, those projects have long lead times, and profit margins for making components are often low. Plus, we lack the scale that many companies are looking for.
Right. Those are the structural issues that NEIOC has highlighted. So how does this scheme address those challenges?
It provides various incentives, like financial support, to attract companies and help them get set up.
So it's about making India an attractive place to manufacture electronics.
Exactly.
Can you tell us more about the specific incentives this scheme offers?
Sure. They're offering CapEx incentives, which help companies with those initial investments. They've also got hybrid incentives.
Hybrid?
Yeah, it's a combination of different support measures. And then there are turnover-linked incentives, which are tied to how much a company sells.
So they get rewarded for hitting sales targets?
Exactly. The turnover-linked incentive runs for 6 years, plus they can get an extra year as a grace period. And for those CapEx incentives, the support covers investments made within the first 5 years after a project gets approved.
What kind of projects are eligible for this scheme?
It's open to both greenfield and brownfield projects. Greenfield being brand new ventures, and brownfield involving expanding or upgrading existing facilities.
Okay, that makes sense.
The base year for calculating those turnover incentives is financial year 2024-25. And to make sure everything runs smoothly, they've designated a project management agency, or PMA, as the main agency in charge of implementing this scheme.
Sounds organized.
It is.
So for those prepping for the UPSC, how does this scheme connect with what they need to know?
Well, this is highly relevant to the economy section of the syllabus, especially when it comes to the manufacturing sector, industrial policy, and how India trades with the rest of the world.
Important topics.
It also ties into science and technology because of the nature of the electronics industry. And of course, it has implications for national security by reducing our reliance on foreign suppliers.
So understanding the scheme, it's crucial for the exam.
Absolutely.
Let's turn our attention now to the environment. The IUCN recently released the first ever green status assessment for the lion.
That's right, Panthera leo to be precise.
This is a pretty big deal in the world of conservation, isn't it?
It is. The green status assessment offers a new way of looking at things, a complement to the well-known IUCN Red List.
Most people are familiar with the Red List, but what's the difference?
The Red List is all about evaluating the risk of extinction.
How likely a species is to disappear.
Exactly. But the green status goes beyond that. It evaluates species recovery.
So it looks at how well conservation efforts are working.
Precisely. It measures their success.
Interesting. So what does the green status say about the lion?
Well, unfortunately, it says that the lion is largely depleted.
Largely depleted. even though it's still listed as vulnerable on the red list.
That's right.
What does that mean? Largely depleted. What's the significance for the lion?
It means that human activity has really prevented the lion from playing its natural role in the ecosystem.
From fulfilling its ecological purpose.
Exactly. Sadly, lions are already extinct in some regions.
Where are they completely gone?
North Africa and Southwest Asia.
That's heartbreaking. But there is some good news, right?
There is. The assessment highlights some conservation success stories.
Where have efforts been successful?
In parts of West and Central Africa, South Africa, and even India, conservation efforts have been crucial in preventing more lion populations from disappearing.
That's encouraging to hear. Can you give us a little background on this whole IUCN Green Status Initiative? When did it start and what's the overall aim?
The idea of having green lists to measure conservation success, not just for species but also for ecosystems and protected areas, was first proposed at the World Conservation Congress in 2012.
So it's been in the works for a while.
Yes. The main idea behind the green status is to add another dimension to the red list. While the red list warns us about extinction, the green status tells us about recovery, about what's working, what we need to do more of.
More hopeful perspective.
You could say that.
Yeah.
It also lets us celebrate those conservation wins, even for species that might not be on the brink of extinction.
Like that saltwater crocodile example you mentioned.
Exactly. It's a species that, while not facing immediate extinction, still needs a lot of help to fully recover across its historical range.
Right. So how does this green status system work?
Well, they use 8 different categories to classify species.
Ranging from what to what?
From extinct in the wild to critically depleted, largely depleted, moderately depleted, slightly depleted, fully recovered, non-depleted.
And I imagine there's a category for when there's just not enough information.
You got it, the indeterminate category.
That makes sense. So how many species have been assessed using this green status so far?
They've completed over 100 assessments, and you can find them on the IUCN Red List website.
So how does the green status define fully recovered? When can we say a species has bounced back?
Well, it's considered fully recovered when it's present throughout its original range, including areas with human activity.
Just not surviving in isolated pockets.
Right. It also means having healthy populations across that whole range, populations that are not at a high risk of disappearing. And here's the key part. A fully recovered species has to be doing what it's supposed to do in the ecosystem, fulfilling its ecological role. Host.